On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Jay Como. He is the global head of data governance and operations at T. Rowe Price. We're going to be talking about simplifying data governance. So we're going to dive in and talk about why some of these policies are complicated. How do you tie them to business outcomes? And how do you actually go about simplifying some of these data governance policies? We're going to be talking about where Gen AI sits within helping solve some of the challenges within governance, and also where's the impact? Where's the transformational impact that we'd like to see from this? And there's a couple other things in there. We'll just see how far we get. Jay, I do appreciate your time. Thanks for joining.
Oh, pleasure. Great to see you again. Appreciate you having me.
Absolutely. All right, let's go ahead and dive in. So talking about data governance, I think a lot of people, if they're not within the space, or even if they are within the space, there is a stigma of it being a little bit heavy, slow. Those are some maybe just words we'll just leave with now. And I guess from that perception to reality, talk to us a little bit about, from your perspective, governance, what you see and what stakeholders externally see.
I think the stigma has certainly been earned over the years, and maybe rightfully so in the early days, particularly around data governance, because what had to happen at those times was sort of a stop. Let's make sure that we're governing this the right way. Now that we know that there's this thing called data governance and there's positive reasons for it, even if we've not done a fantastic job of explaining what those reasons are, I think the stigma is earned. And I think the successful pivots I've seen away from that to sort of erase the stigma is not placing your traditional governance type folks in these functions and making it exciting so you can attract talent that looks at it differently. And that's not to say that you're not placing leaders and practitioners in these governance roles that don't care about governance or don't care about controls. They have to. That's a foundational element of the job. But can you seed leaders into these functions, especially if you're starting it anew, where you're maybe taking another crack at making it better, that are commercially focused, that really sound like product leaders, or might even sound like salespeople, because they're seeing the big picture. And ultimately, you kind of have to have those type of competencies because of that stigma. You really have to sell the reasons why we're asking consumers and producers of data to actually have good, strong governance in place. There needs to be a sales effort to that. So I've seen a lot of success over the last few years. I've been a part of it as well. Is you see really strategic people in there, maybe digitally inclined. How do I digitize data? And which in effect is a really good way to govern, because you're taking manual processes that have opportunities to err, and you're digitizing that. So you're enhancing your governance and controls, but you're also becoming much more viable and faster to market. And so I think the real mission is to take these classic data governance programs and get the right thinking into it. And I'll talk a lot, Amir, about business outcomes, because that's the commercial aspect. And what are we doing? Why are we asking you to do these things that in the past would have maybe been a stigma? Well, we're asking you to make the data better so you can do better analytics, so you can drive more revenue. We're asking you to invest in making the data better, maybe digitized, alarm bells going off vis-a-vis data quality, so we can actually onboard clients faster. We can have better marketing campaigns, and we can reduce our regulatory compliance and all of the burden that goes with that. And when you start talking about it outside of that stigma-driven sort of, we have to do this because it's control, versus, hey, these are the 3 big strategic initiatives at the firm to create revenue. These are the types of governance functions or data product functions that are aligned with governance that we can supply for you that'll actually help you enact on your journey and accomplish your OKRs and your top line revenue growth.
I love the explanation. I think, a bunch of follow-ups come to mind, but I guess the first one, you mentioned finding different voices to fill some of these data governance roles. I guess when you kind of look at the landscape and you look at the process and understanding the process and being able to implement process, sometimes people do get comfortable with process. I think that's just inevitable. We all like it. We're all creatures of habit. We love to know that we've done something someplace and this is how we're going to do things. When you are looking at data governance now as it's evolving in the future, how do you balance somebody who's coming in, let's say, to the role and has more of that tie to the business, a little bit more business focused and also has to balance the data governance processes. How does that get balanced between the two?
It's a decision you have to make. You have to ask yourself, if you're the chief data officer, do I want to have a governance function that I feel is crossing every T, dotting every I, and is highly governed and possibly not flexible for commercial delivery? And obviously, that's like the answer is going to be no. But if you don't ask yourself that versus, and then you have to sort of fill in the blank, okay, what else? Because that doesn't sound too fun. Well, what else is there? And then you can't just assume the opposite of that is there's no controls, the business gets to do whatever they want. There's so much of ground in between that is very productive. And where I've seen decisions made, maybe not even, maybe they're subliminally made that you cannot be on this platform any longer because it is not standard, it's not authoritative data source. And then you've got all sorts of analytics users that are on the platform saying, okay, great, what are you going to give me as a replacement? Well, we don't have a replacement yet. Okay, then how am I supposed to do my analytics to create campaigns or revenue creation? And I've had to go in as a CDO and sort of get in the middle of those conversations in past lives about negotiating, exit strategies, extensions. And that taught me at an early stage, one of my first data roles, that you really have to be open-minded about there's multiple ways how to achieve controls. There's multiple ways on how to achieve governance, and there's multiple timings and such. So if you think about sort of getting out of the proverbial box and thinking, I can still govern and be highly controlled and have a little bit of business flexibility and a way at the back end of that flexibility to ensure that you're going to get to that end game, maybe not quite as fast as pace, but you know you'll get there and you have a commitment to get there. You have a lot of ground in the middle that you can actually be very business focused. And I think you have to ask yourself, how much do I want to be commercially focused? How much do I only care about controls? Either of those two extremes aren't good. Somewhere in the middle, a conscious decision to kind of balance out controls versus revenue is a sweet spot that I've found. And I think that's the right approach for most firms.
When you're looking at stakeholders, and obviously, I think it's safe to say people like to spend what they need to spend on governance. Maybe, it is a cost center. They view it as such. You're mentioning, obviously, with a focus to revenue generation, allowing people to do their work. When you're going to sit down with the stakeholders and explaining how you're going to re-envision, re-architect the data governance team, how does our first conversation look? Because obviously, when I'm hearing it, I'm like, write the check. I'm excited. This sounds good. But obviously, if it was that easy, every governance team would look very forward-thinking, and probably we're not seeing that.
It's not that easy. And I've personally struggled with telling the story the right way in my career. And I think it's like anything, the more you practice, the better you get at it. But it's never, hey, we're going to write a check for governance. It's not even worth saying it. And, some of the practitioners these days will say, we don't even call it data governance. We call it data enablement, which I think is just, okay, that's a play on words. And I'm not sure that I feel comfortable going there because that's a little bit of tomfoolery. It is governance, but when you're talking to business leaders that are cutting the checks, you're not asking them to spend money on governance. That's just a byproduct. You're asking them to spend money on the critical infrastructure and the critical processes that are going to drive their value. And you happen to align governance to that. And many of the debates I've had about federated models, trying to get different lines of businesses to invest in a federated line of business chief data officer, where they would say, I don't really need that. And I would say, well, what do you think that person does? And they'd say, well, I don't know. That's part of the mystery. Tell me about it. I'm like, well, let me ask you a question. Do you have a lot of manual processes? And the answer in most cases is yes. Well, your chief data officer, your line of business chief data officer, or division data officer, they're your digital strategists. They're going to look at the underlying data and the journey of that data, and they're going to identify where it's breaking and where it's being manually manipulated. And if you empower them, they're going to come back with strategies on how to fix that. Don't you need more automation in your life? Most people in business are going to say yes. And so it's about selling the capabilities and selling the art of possible and doing it in small enough chunks that actually you can see delivery. Because you can't come with this grandiose scheme, right? You have to come into like, you have a problem with this widget. if you had a CDO, a line of business CDO, they would probably get into the root cause and drive really hard at fixing that, digitizing it, and making it a better journey. And then at the same time, all of a sudden, you've got great governance as well. So it's never selling governance, in my humble opinion. It's really about selling capabilities, and governance is just the ancillary benefit.
I like it. I guess when you're looking at data quality and you're looking, and I guess it's just I don't know. I will ask you. I'm curious. Is there a relationship between data quality within an organization and the simplicity or being really difficult, challenging data governance policies? Are there direct correlations? Or are the two non-related?
Is there a correlation between the complexity of policies versus the quality of the data? Is that the question?
Yeah, as data quality gets more poor, does governance have to be more complicated?
That's a good question. I suppose it's a case by case, but I think as data quality gets more poor or doesn't get any better, I actually think your policies and standards actually need to get easier, because you've probably lost something along the way because you're not activating what you need to. And so if your data is complicated and your quality is not great or it's poor, you should really look at your policies and the enforcement of your policies and make sure it's simple. It's got a nice, easy touch. Look, early in my career, I was afraid of reading policy. I didn't like it. It would put me to sleep. And as I started to get really interested in it, I realized that if you write a really high level, quick to the point policy, it's going to keep people interested. It's almost like blogging versus a novel. Your policy should be more like a blog, not a novel, because you're going to lose the audience. So if you can make it really simple and readable, then that maybe is teasing out the things that you can then institute following those policies and standards to get better at your data quality. I'd also say that having really complex data isn't always the reason why you have poor quality. It certainly makes it harder to clean up. But I think it's because you don't have the muscle memory and the commitment to having quality at your consumer level. So producing it, and probably the policy aspect being Byzantine, might be part of it as well.
That's fair. I guess when it comes to looking at newer technologies, I guess a lot of people are talking about data governance in the last year or two because Gen AI has put some spotlight on some of these issues. When you're looking at advanced technologies, generative AI being one, and you're looking at actual governance challenges and actually how to help solve some of these governance challenges, are there tools that are being developed on the generative side to actually aid some of the obstacles previously seen within data governance?
Yeah, there are. It's interesting because I still think we're probably at the bleeding edge of this, and the journey for most of us in these kind of roles has been, okay, a couple of years ago, large language models and artificial intelligence has turned to this really cool thing that everyone's talking about called generative AI. And wow, we're not talking about the cloud so much anymore. We've talked about something else that's a big buzzword, and no one really knew quite what it was, but everyone was talking about it. And then the governance folks were like, oh, well, what does this mean? How do I manage it? How do I control it? How do I control it and still be commercially viable, especially into this mode that's quite exploratory? And then the real good ones would say, and how can it help me? So it turned into, oh my, how am I going to manage this for my institution? To, can I use it to help manage my institution? And I feel as though in the last year, after looking at that, really critical about offerings and the current edge of technology, I feel like it's definitely woken up. And I do think that I'm excited about a lot of opportunities to increase normal governance activities at a much faster pace of delivery with really good accuracy. There's really cool models that are going on right now that aid governance: metadata collection, data quality rule identification by pattern recognition, lineage because of pattern recognition. And these are all really tough things to do. And so if the technology is good as I think it is, it's going to be a game changer for the governance folks.
Going back to simplifying policies, obviously we're some of the emerging generative AI technologies that you just mentioned. Obviously, when it comes to simplifying policies, where does The policy has to be a blog, not a novel. I think that was something you mentioned. But as we're looking at some of these advanced technologies, and you mentioned people from the outside coming in and having a fresh view, in terms of simplifying and being able to apply the simpler policies, and then also being able to leverage some of these generative AI solutions that are coming out, is there an order? Do you potentially focus on simplifying? Do you bring in tools? Do you make sure the plumbing's right before you do that, or what's your thoughts on that?
It's really going to depend on the situation. I was at dinner once, and this drove me crazy. There was a bunch of data folks, and this individual said, "I've been in my job for 2 years, and I haven't written one policy." And he pounded the table, and everyone's like, "Yeah, we don't need policy. It's too bureaucratic." And I don't have a lot of hair, but a little bit I had, I was starting to pull out. And like, you do need to have policies and standards, because that sets the tone, and it also shows the organization how to enforce what good looks like. And ultimately, you want policies and standards to result in, when there are bad data defects that could hurt your business, you want them looked at like an audit finding, where you have to have a remedy to that. And if you don't remedy it in a certain amount of time, agreed upon time, of course, but that gets very visible in the old banking world that I grew up in and still live in terms of financial services. When you have an audit finding, a major one, if it doesn't get cured in the agreed upon time, it goes to your board audit committee. So you always want to adhere to those deadlines, and you can get extensions, but you don't want to ask for too many of those. I don't think data defects are at that level yet, but those of us that care about it really would like to see that we take it that serious. So you have to really look at where are those problems and what policies are either in place that I need to fix because there's the novel, and how do we chunk it up a little bit? How do we redo it? Don't be afraid to redo the policies. It's actually kind of fun if you make and get engagement as well from the people you want to read it. Get them involved with it and help them get involved with chopping it down a bit. I think it becomes very empowering. So I think that's the first, is understanding the efficacy of it. But in a situation for firms that are dealing with emerging technology like we're seeing right now in the marketplace, you probably have to move pretty quickly to put something in place to protect you on Gen AI in particular, because it is still a bit wild, wild west, and that's changing every minute, but still a little bit unknown. So you probably want to match it up against that. And then lastly, you want to look at your major strategic initiatives where you're tying your business outcomes. If you're kind of ungoverned there, you might want to put the right policies and standards in place at the right readable level to make sure you're covering those as well.
If you are in a data governance position, whether you're new or you've been in the position for a time, and you're thinking, I would like to simplify some of my processes. I would like to start thinking outside the box. I want to be that person. I don't want somebody else to come in to do that. I think sometimes starting points are hard because what we're used to is what we're used to. And there's obviously risk in doing things slightly different. But if you wanted to make and implement some of these changes, you do want to start simplifying. What are the initial steps? Where do you start so that you can actually go on this journey that you've been describing to us?
So I know your background, and you've got a technology background in addition to finding talent. And data tends to be many, many years ago, functions of data were in technology and eventually kind of grew apart a little bit. It's obviously very closely aligned. So it's pretty technical. And what I would say is, no matter how good your technical stack is for data, it's still a people business. And to do the things that you asked, it starts with relationships. It starts with building your coalition. And especially if you're new to an organization, you want to just get to know everyone's problems, and you want to do a lot of listening. The old days, it used to be, don't do anything for 90 days, 6 months, whatever, do a lot of listening. Make sure you're going to activate at the right pace. And this day and age, you can't wait that long. What you really need to do is a balance of, I need to tackle something very quickly that's going to have major impact and fix something straight away for a couple reasons. One, it's going to give me credibility as a new person. Two, it's going to solve a problem, which is really good. So you got to make sure you go after the right thing, your proverbial low-hanging fruit. And at the same time, you're cultivating, what are those things that we can do it a little differently? We can take governance as a solution and a solve to a problem. And you can start to glean those by just talking to your colleagues around the firm, laterally, up, down, everyone that will have an opinion. And as you start to broad scan, you're going to start to get some themes. And as you get those themes, you can start to dig in. And in my experience, most departments, business areas, if you say, I'd like to help you, they're usually going to let you. And so if you say, look, data's kind of a problem, and the reason we're here is to help fix it, whether it's an advisory role, we're going to help you by giving counsel, or it's actually, you can outsource it to me because I'm staffed for it, whatever that scenario might be, most people will take that help, especially in this day and age, because it's so important. From a regulatory perspective, everyone wants to know about Gen AI. It's all data. And so, and a lot of people are uncertain about it. So if some expert's coming to them saying, can I help you? It's usually going to be yes, but they have to trust you first. You get that trust by building those relationships.
I love that. I think that's great advice across a lot of different areas, especially in this particular area as well. Yeah, and maybe last question, because I am kind of curious. We have talked a lot about governance. You mentioned obviously trying to relabel it as data enablement. We talked about simplifying processes. Gen AI can come in and actually help us with some of the lifting that has traditionally been difficult. I guess if you were to go to the top agenda, like when you mentioned data literacy, data enablement, the type of cultural aspects to an organization to actually help simplify some of these processes, to actually have it be that people are aware and they're bought in. When you look at that top line of what we like to call culture, that becomes tricky. Obviously, I know every company has its particular culture, so we can't talk about a specific, but generally speaking, when you're trying to set that tone and direction of making sure we're headed down the right path, what are some things that you've seen that has helped previously?
I think what you said about culture is really important. So, I've been at institutions where it's to get stuff done at all pace. It doesn't matter how you do it. It's all about execution. And in those scenarios, you're just looking at the end game. It's not about socializing away. It's not about doing it nicely in some instances. It's really about getting to the end game. I'll admit, I don't love being in those situations. Well, I've grown up in my career being an individual that leads teams that get stuff done and prided myself on that. I prefer to do it in as nice a way as possible. And so there are some other institutions where it's like, this is what you need to do, and here's why. And here's how you get it done. So that's a different approach than just get it done quickly. I think ultimately it comes down to kind of obviously paying attention to the culture, but paying attention to the tenor of your management committee. And I've always been a big fan when you're doing these kind of transformational changes or governance programs, you want to have as many members of your firm's management committee interested in what you're doing. And frankly, you want them to like what you're doing, because the more fans you have up there, the better chances you have of success. And so one approach I took, and this really is data fluency at its finest. And what I would say is, don't get too caught up in data literacy and data fluency, like I have to do this many trainings and we have to do this many certifications and we've got a SharePoint site. I've seen it done well when you just say, let's just talk about business outcomes that happen to have effect to data. And I was in a very big digital transformation program in a prior life. And I had two management committee members that didn't like each other. And I got them at the table with a third one. And they were agreeing about how important data lineage was and how important it was for me in my role in the firm. I was a line of business chief data officer, and how important it was for me and my peer who ran enterprise data across the firm, the CDAL, how tough our jobs are and how we have to have the right metadata recertified. And these three management committee members, were talking to each other in this very technical language of data. And that's when I knew, that's the pinnacle of data literacy. When you've got those three talking about it, because culturally we took the right approach to get them there, it was really cool. And it wasn't about a SharePoint site for literacy or training. It was really about talking about the mission we were on, why it was important, where we were failing, where we were succeeding, where we needed their help. And it ended in a culmination of them kind of being very fluent in data and being supportive of the program. It was really cool to see that be a part of it.
I thought that'd be my last question, but I was thinking to tie things together, and I think this would be interesting because people might be listening to this that don't have a background in data governance. They might be, within the business, they might be ancillary technology. I guess if you wanted to get started, and the reason I'm going to ask this is you mentioned other people outside of the domain could come in, do a good job, bring a different perspective, all those things. If you are outside of the data governance space currently, and you're like, hey, listen, I actually find this interesting. I'd like to be a part of this. I'd like to get into it. How does somebody that is currently not with data governance experience kind of migrate into their first role? Just general advice. I know obviously every use case is different, but how do you start doing that?
Yeah, two things I'll say. I was teaching at the University of Maryland. I'm in Baltimore. We're big in the community at T. Rowe Price. And I was doing a tech talk, not a tech track, but a tech talk to a bunch of University of Maryland students. Most of them were graduating. There's a couple of PhD students there. And more than one said, talk to me, like, how do you get into a career in policy, like data policy? And I was so thrilled, like, you guys are actually interested in policy. That's a fantastic way to get going. And so it's really cool that that's exciting for new college grads to think that through. It wasn't the majority, but there was more than I would have guessed. I think because of podcasts like this, there's others that are very much more very data specific. There's a boatload of books that have been written. I think when I'm sourcing talent, what I used to say in other roles is, here's what we need to do. We need to hire people that are, for whatever business we're supporting, people that are experts in that business. So, for example, they might be experts in treasury, maybe liquidity, or financial planning and analysis, FP&A, or accounting. They need to be experts in the business. They need to be highly digitally inclined, so they're comfortable working on programs that are digital transformation. And if they know data, that's fantastic. We'll teach them governance because that's the easy part. But if they've got high energy and octane to do those other things, you want them to be a part of it. And I always add in too, are they going to have that sort of commercial view and be able to sell for you? Can they represent you? And people look at them and don't think they're a stigma because they're in data governance. They think that they're a trusted, valued partner because of the energy they're bringing. The data stuff's easy. That's like, we can teach anyone data. You can listen to podcasts, you can read the books. It's really about the intangibles, about that energy, and obviously having some subject matter expertise as well. Like a business line subject matter expertise, not necessarily governance.
I like it. That's fantastic. I think it makes me feel good that we kind of covered various parts of data governance, with not just about simplifying. I think we tacked on a few other things. Jay, I appreciate your time. I know we covered, some different areas, and we probably are going to leave some questions that we didn't address or didn't get to. If somebody does want to reach out to ask you something, what is a good way of connecting with you?
Best way for me is LinkedIn. I'm fairly active there. Jay Como on LinkedIn. You'll see I work at T. Rowe Price. Happy to have conversations.
All right, brilliant. We'll make sure to include that in the show notes. Again, thanks for being on. I appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, that's it for this episode. Be back again. Different guest, different topic. But until then, two things. One, I think we talked about simplifying data governance. I think Jay walked us through how you approach it, stakeholder perspective. We talked about OKRs tying to business outcomes. We even talked about where Gen AI is sitting in relation to helping do some of the lifting within the space and actually simplify things and make things run better. I don't know, maybe that's not exactly what it's for, but I do feel that we're going to see a lot of efficiencies gain with Gen AI based on what I was hearing. And I think that's going to be exciting given there is a transformational component to this. So bright future, and touched on how to actually maybe start off a career in data governance if you're interested in that. So please share this episode with somebody else who might find it helpful, beneficial. I'd appreciate that. Otherwise, like, subscribe, comment. Let me know how the podcast is going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.